Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name's Haydyn, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about behavioural design systems for healthcare this morning. So, just a really brief intro about myself. Firstly, apologies for the photo; it's the only one I could find. This is just a one-off LinkedIn. Appreciate it's not very good, but just a little bit about me. So, I've been in user experience for just over 15 years now. I've worked in lots of different types of environments. Yeah, I've worked in agency, telco, fintech, and the last 6 years I've been embedded in sort of biotech, digital healthcare, patient healthcare, HCP types of stuff. So yeah, been right on the edge of it. Done lots of really interesting stuff, which isn't the topic of today's talk, but yeah, lots of different types of research. I have a background in HCI, computing behavioral psychology. I'm also a doctoral researcher at the moment in health psychology on HCI. So I'm looking at a fascinating area called digital phenotyping and artificial intelligence. Um, so yeah, if you're interested in that, ping me. I'm always interested to chat to people. I love mountain biking, golfing, and I've got family and friends in California. So that's just a little bit about me. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be talking about this idea of behavioral design systems for healthcare. I'm going to break it down into three parts, really. Excuse me. The first part is about taking a quick look at the complexities of healthcare models and why this is important for designers and researchers. I'm then going to explain the behavioral design systems model and then wrap it up. And today I'm not here on behalf of AstraZeneca. I'm just here to talk about my own thoughts, my own experiences. This is basically a bit of a structured brain dump from the last 6 years about what I've observed when working in digital healthcare, patient strategy, behavioural science, and behavioural design as well. Okay, and just because I am an academic as well as working in commerce, plain language summary. What does this talk about today? Well, it's aiming to take a holistic view of the complexities of behavioral design systems, and I will clarify what I mean by behavioral design systems later in our discussion, and what this basically means for UX people in practice. So, how can we merge a lot of the complexities that go on in health psychology, applied behavioral science, our UX practice? I'm going to be using the analogy of design systems to really bring this idea of components across. And the components that we'll look at are context, framing, intervention, collaboration, and measurement. So if you're expecting sort of a detailed look at UI componentry that you might find in typical design systems, it's not quite that, although it is part of it as well. So this is trying to look at a systems thinking, systems level approach to design systems that might be useful in practice, not the typical design systems that you might find to operationalize software, although that is important. So just to set the scene really quickly, I just want to talk about some very, very basic healthcare models, both at a country and a few other levels as well. This is something that is really important to all of us, and this is really at the top. And I know it was touched on in the last talk, but delivery models for healthcare in each country, different parts of the world, are very, very different. So, for example, healthcare isn't the same everywhere. It's very diverse and complex. And this is a really good foundational aspect for the UX person to understand that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach in designing digital health outcomes because of the way the countries, and different healthcare systems deal with digital healthcare, and that's only one part of it. So, for example, you think of the healthcare delivery models at a global or country scale. If you want to do some reading, some really interesting stuff, important to us, the beverage model, then you've got the out-of-pocket model, national health, Bismarck, etc. This is talk's not about that, but it's just to set the scene that healthcare is delivered differently in different places. And then if you go down a level, you have something called social determinants, which is all the interesting, gooey social stuff that interacts with people and environment and things like that. And these are the social determinants of health. But there's a dark side to this, unfortunately, is that these health variables, can and do, unfortunately, impact the access to and quality of healthcare treatment received and therefore the impact of behavioural health choices at various levels. I've just put two there, group and individual. Obviously, there's more than that. And obviously, at the moment, health equity is a huge topic and something that UX people should be interested in. So these factors also have a considerable bearing on why we're looking at behavioural design systems as well. So just understanding the economic and social conditions that influence healthcare. For example, social economic status, education and knowledge, living conditions of people, the location, all of these can be expanded on quite dramatically. But just having a basic awareness of this can fundamentally change the way that you design patient outcomes. And then just very briefly, looking at individual determinants as well. So these are individual variables that influence behavioral health choices. Some are biological, some psychological, and all the interesting bits in between. So on the right, we've got things like genetics, and obviously epigenetics at the moment is massive, personality and personalization, and then cognition, so people's thoughts and attitudes and actions towards healthcare as well. So what's the impact for UX people? Well, basically having an understanding of individual level variables opens up a really complex but exciting multidisciplinary approach. Again, why we need to think towards some standardized models. And at this level, we are starting to think about how information is displayed, the way that behavioral science and behavioral design can impact choices, accessibility, designing for personalized medicine, and working with hardware, software, things like that, and even wetware. So this is a really interesting thing to think about. So why have I said all of this? Wasn't to give you a health psychology lecture. It's just to get the point that healthcare models, delivery, people's behavioral health choices, and all the stuff, all the determinants that influence them, these create a really complex systems design challenge for UX people when working in delivering digital healthcare solutions. So if we are working in this area, which it likely is, we are on this call today, we need to be aware of these and the way that they frame design and research opportunities. So I've just put together a very sort of generic, randomish systems map. There's no upstream, downstream here. It's just to make the point that all of these things come together, and many, many more as well, things I haven't put in here, which affect the complexity of what we design. I gave a talk a couple of years back actually about the quality of digital therapeutics and healthcare apps, and they're not in a great state. They might have advanced in the last couple of years, but a lot of it's due to the complexities that exist in the healthcare system. Okay, so what does that really mean for us? Well, the second part, now that we understand a bit of that, is to talk about behavioral design systems. Now, I said initially these are different to the design systems that you may have, the stuff that you're used to looking at. If you go to, I don't know, Airbnb's design system or another big corporate's design system, you'll find all the componentry and so on and so forth. This is a systems level, a couple levels higher approach to behavioral design systems, because it has to incorporate the behavioral science and health psychology side when we're designing complex health products. So let's set the scene just really quickly. And this was pretty evident for me when I started working in digital healthcare about 6 years ago. You know, we know that healthcare is complex. And this doesn't often translate well for designers or researchers. For me, I came to Earth with a very big thud when I realized that designing or working with teams, operationalizing teams in research to design high quality digital health experiences is really, really complex. And one of the big problems that we have, or challenges actually to reframe it, is framing the problem behaviorally is not always done, because mainly you need expert knowledge to understand healthcare and the psychology, the behavioral science around it. So what are some of the barriers that make designing for digital healthcare patient experiences hard? Well, we've seen that regulation is key. If you work on regulated medical devices, class 1, class 2, the software is a medical device, like I mentioned, and lots of other regulation as well. But even if you don't do that, you're still looking for quality. So things like repeatability, consistency, and of course, healthcare and clinical settings, one of the major sort of parts of it, components of it, is evidence and outcomes. So, and we'll touch on this later actually in our measurement component, that are you aligning your clinical and your usability measures together? Okay, so when I got to this point, I wanted to take a step back. And like I said at the beginning, this is sort of a structured brain dump from my last 5 or 6 years working in this space. Um, this slide's very generalized. It may not even be accurate or correct. You might not align with it. You might do on some bits of it. I think that's the good part about discussing this type of work. But this is just my points of view, the things that I've experienced when working in this space. So we have varied levels of behavioral science and its application to user experience, and then behavioral design systems, and then outcomes in digital healthcare. And this is often key to appropriate intervention design. I see a lot of intervention design that's not aligned to a specific theory, it doesn't have evidence, and that makes it a lot harder to measure and then show clinical impact, or even understand if you're targeting the right types of behaviors. What else do I see, or have I seen? Varied use of design patterns to help solve similar problems. So, just random things off the top of my head, for example, when solving for polypharmacy, for example, multiple medications or symptom tracking, or my own experiences with mental health apps when just looking at them to do some peer review. There's lots of different ways to solve the same problems. Now, I'm not sure how big a problem this is, but sort of the psychology brain in me saying it, well, is there a level of consistency for delivery? Can this lead to patient burden and poor usability? Yes, it does. How much of an impact has that had? What does the evidence say? Well, it's still out there to be looked at. What else do I see, or have I seen? Well, mixed approaches to clinical UX research and its impact on product. This is either overly generic research at the beginning of a project, which doesn't really add much value because it's not specific enough, or it's too specific. For example, maybe hardcore health psychology research, which focuses, for example, just on self-monitoring, that misses the bigger picture of the rest of the stuff that goes around it. So that often needs to be balanced. And then the biggest one I see, and the hardest one probably, is this idea of misaligned usability and clinical measurement pathways. And this often leads to over-indexing on the wrong metrics. For example, if you're working on a regulated device or SAMD, you'll obviously have to have evidence to make claims. This is great, but is it at the expense of usability and all the stuff that goes with that? Or do you focus too much on the usability side of an app and miss the point clinically? Obviously, that depends on what space you're working, but it's easy to over index because of lack of knowledge and the complexities that exist. So what's my perspective then? Again, this is just my personal view on behavioral design systems. So I've created, I'm not sure it's quite a model, but it's getting there-ish, and there's some components of it. So my take is that behavioral design systems, or this model, they're built upon these building blocks of components like you would find in an operationalized design system for software use and building. These components that I'm talking about, they're reusable, they're evidence-driven, they're sustainable, and they're repeatable. But arguably, most importantly, they empower not only us, but the ecosystem of contributors and stakeholders when you're working with clinical complexity. And this is often the case in product or service design. Um, I've seen behavioral design systems and models out there that just focus on sort of economic theory or nudge theory that you can build into, your UI library. This isn't that. These aren't isolated nudge principles that you bake into UI, although sometimes they can be useful and powerful. So, what are these five components that I reflect upon personally? Well, they're context, framing, there's the intervention side of things, collaboration, and measurement. And of course, underpinning all of this, these are driven by common UX methods that are adapted for behavioral science and health psychology projects, if you'd like to go into that much detail, and if you have the resource and the specialists on your team. And I've just put in brackets because why would we want to make this harder? Why would we want to then go and be hardcore intervention designers unless that happens, unless that is needed in commercial practice? And we're just going to spend the rest of our talk this morning just going through these five bits, and then just a quick wrap up as well. And I've tried to make this as practical as possible. If you do have any questions, please just let me know, and I'll try and answer them at the end. So this first idea is context, and for me personally, context in behavioral science and behavioral design is a key behavioral driver, especially when it comes to healthcare behaviors. So thinking about why and where people perform health-related behaviors and the resulting impact, especially in our product design, is key in understanding the complexities of individuals, their psychology, and the resulting behavioral design. So if you think about the mini sort of lecture we had before on all the stuff that goes on at an individual, societal, group level with healthcare delivery, where people live, where they're educated, how much they know about health, their patterns, their behaviour. These things don't exist in isolation. I mean, very rarely. Sometimes they do, but there's always context. And behavioural science and especially user experience design, when it's applied, really needs to take these contexts into consideration. So it's really important that we focus on this, and that's the first sort of building block of our five-part model. So some of the questions I thought to myself around this when we're thinking about context are, firstly, what contextual behaviours and knowledge exist in the world now? And I've got some quick wins that's indicated by the stars, and I'll elaborate on them in a little bit. So things like literature review or related secondary studies, uh, arguably, for me, literature reviews and just finding out what exists in the world can really help you frame your own individual context or your group context when you're working on a project. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. What behavioral problems exist and why do they exist? So you can do this, like I've talked about, through targeted primary behavioral research. You'll notice as I go through this talk that I'm method-ish agnostic. I won't be talking about any hardcore behavioral science theory or advocating for a specific process like combi or saying that this health psychology theory is best, because I firmly believe that you need the infrastructure around that, and then you need the expertise to be able to dictate or encourage you to figure out which is the best way to do that. So I won't be saying which is best. I will be talking about UX methods though. The third point is about how are these behaviors impacted through complex systems and why. And one of the best ways to do that is sort of systems mapping and action context, which kind of loosely tie into logic models that we'll talk about later. And then one of the key things that I've always struggled with, I think is a fair thing for me to say when I think back. What will I do with this contextual information, and how do I prioritize it? Now, when we get into regulated healthcare or non-regulated, you are beginning-ish to work towards experimental research and design, proper hypothesis creation. So, null hypothesis and an alternative, or just general business assumptions as well. This talk doesn't include lots of commercial aspects, but of course that's really, really important. So a hypothesis creation and measurement strategy fits in with the context block as well. So what's a quick win? Well, like I said before, doing a lit review can save you huge amounts of time and energy when understanding health-related behavioral science and psychology for context framing. You don't always need to reinvent the wheel. In fact, you rarely do, because there's a lot of stuff out there. Something that I'm going to be running through with my team pretty shortly is about how to do a lightweight, commercially orientated literature review, so that we don't spend or duplicate time for research studies or design outputs that have already been done or that we can build upon. So think about this when you're context setting with your problems. See what's in the world already that can help frame your context as well. And then I've talked about framing. This is the best friend of context, is framing. So what is framing? This is our second component of our behavioral design system model. Well, framing gives us the opportunity to both understand and also create or construct these behavioral frames of reference for our project, which is really, really important. So we mentioned in the blurb for this talk as well, when it was advertised, we're going back to basics here, which is absolutely fine. We don't need to be really clever or do, weird and wacky methods. Sometimes, in fact, all the time, nailing the basics, getting that right can be just as powerful. So when we're thinking about behavioral framing, we're thinking about how these frames and contexts interact with individuals and the constraints that we can have from a product perspective. And framing is an immensely powerful tool. So again, some questions to think about when you're framing, perhaps if you'd like to use this model or just steal one bit of it. Now, how do I use it? So asking questions like, where do my behavioral frames of reference take place? What are they? So for example, conceptual modeling, and we'll talk about that in a second. Who or what am I framing behaviorally and why? Now, I've put behavioral descriptions. I did put personas before, and I know many of you on the call, as soon as I say that word, will groan. And I've been in this industry 15 plus years, and I've seen the good, bad, and the ugly of personas. But I must say that since working in psychology, behavioral science, and in healthcare, the power of using behavioral data to understand people actually, in my own personal opinion, makes personas a little bit more palatable. It's not a panacea, but it does help when understanding people. You can write out behavioral descriptions any way you want to, but it's just something to think about as well. Behaviorally driven data personas can, in some instances, be really impactful. The third question I thought about is what are the behavioral sequences at each level? So how do they interact? What is the interaction between them? And of course, we can go back to basic things like in interaction design and HCI, storyboarding, but using the behavioral data that we have to go beyond just the behavior of the product itself, but also the behaviors of people. If you've done storyboards like I have countless times, it often focuses the technology and context without being too descriptive. But I think with using the behavioral science approach, you can add a layer of depth to that, which makes them really powerful. And then something that we've had to battle through, and I've had to battle through personally and professionally as well, when using sort of behavioral science, are my behavioral frames realistic? Are you going off on a tangent? Are they scalable? Are they impactful? And one of the things you can do is use a framing assumption workshop or activity to say, okay, I've got these things, these behavioral frames. I've got my stuff in order. Does it make sense? So a quick win. Conceptual models. Conceptual models are often underutilized or overlooked in user experience. So describing what your product does behaviorally, both from a product and a person perspective, does and will have an impact from a health delivery perspective. It's an immensely powerful tool. And just to reiterate the point that context and framing are really good friends. Okay, component 3, what's this? Well, it's about intervention design. So if you are an immensely skilled intervention designer, then probably stick to your own process. But for those of us that are trying to work between the worlds of behavioral science and user experience, there's a bit more nuance to it in my personal opinion. So this component's about intervention design. Interventions obviously form, from a design perspective, really help to pull the context and the framing together really in a targeted way. We can then use our own UX skills and knowledge to create more robust evidence-based approaches. So some of you might be familiar with this stuff. Some of you might think it belongs in a different order. This is not linear. It's just a way to think about things. One of the things that I've starred here is, what is the point of my intervention? What's it trying to solve? Which is different from my conceptual model that describes what it is. But what's the point of my intervention? So like we'd use in the design thinking process, a statement of aim. And you can do the same thing here, an intervention aim statement. Other things to think about, a bit more behaviorally driven, a bit more theory driven, perhaps. What determinants and behavioral components can I use or manipulate? For example, you can use behavioral components analysis or technique selection. I said I'd stay high level, and this is probably one area that I will just reference the BCT taxonomy stuff that's related to the COMBI and the theoretical domains model. Again, this talk's not about that, and that's not the only way to do behavioral science or behavioral design, but that is a helpful jumping off point, unless you're going to go deep into a specific area or disease state that you're designing for, which I haven't really mentioned about today. Another question to think about from an intervention design perspective: how will my intervention and the components or the determinants interact with my product and environment? So again, another way of modeling this is through a logic model. There are sort of specific ways to do this, but you can mix and match with UX things as well. So something to think about. And then from a practical perspective, what can my platform support now to deliver the intervention? If you've built a tech stack, or you've got plugging into APIs, or whatever you're doing, leveraging software and hardware and artificial intelligence, it's worth thinking about design systems analysis and the creation of that and how it all plugs in as well. Just a quick win to think about for yourself if there's anything you want to take away. So defining your intervention statement can help you prioritize the goals of the project and really align back to your theory if you want to, and your measurement, which is crucial. Like I said before, having goal statements is common in the design thinking process, but maybe not so much in digital healthcare and commercial practice. It depends what you do, where you work, who you are. Again, just my own personal reflections. Okay, point 4, or component 4, which is about collaboration. So what's this? Well, it's basically saying that interventions and all the good stuff that we've done, right, doesn't exist in isolation. Again, we're sort of going back to the context part of this. A complex system of individual and societal variables, like we've talked about, all the different stuff that we mentioned before, can and does impact the quality, the adoption, and the creation of intervention design and your behavioral design system as well. Just something that I was told very early on in my career as well. I can't remember who told me this, but to create for people, people need to create with you, and that stuck with me throughout my career. That if you want to create complex things, then you have to make sure that people are there to create them with you. And there's some obvious ways of doing that, which we'll talk about now. So the first one is that who is important in the creation of my intervention? And I've simply put co-design. Now I know there's many flavors of co-design, different ways of doing it. There's the participatory sign. I can't say that properly. And there's all sorts of interesting ways of slicing and dicing this. So think about when you are doing health-related projects that co-design is a really powerful way, if it's done correctly, to help you build or think about your behavioral design system and the resulting output. What else is there to think about? Well, how do I ensure that I select and choose the right behavioral variables? So this involves expert involvement or training. It is really helpful to have people who are deeply skilled in behavioral science or psychology or health related sciences, not to mention stakeholders from the commercial aspect, regulatory aspect, and so on and so forth. So all of this adds up to a quality output and should be part of this component, this collaboration component within your behavioral design system. Another question that I asked myself were, what limitations are there in my intervention or behavioral design system from a collaboration perspective? And this is about constraint mapping. This is one of the key things that impacts what you do and the quality of your output as well. And then finally, from a collaboration perspective, how do I ensure that key stakeholders understand the value proposition of what I'm doing? You can do this through business and value canvas workshops. We've tried to layer behavioral stuff on top of this, but just be aware that not everyone really sometimes cares or is bothered, which is fine, or understands exactly what you're trying to do. So half the battle with this stuff as well is how you communicate and collaborate with key stakeholders when you're leveraging the behavioral side of healthcare as well. Okay, and then a quick win for this. So realizing your constraints, like I've mentioned, both in relation to adapting behavioral science into commercial reality and the limitations of technical teams, how you collaborate with them, their skills, as well as design outcomes can greatly influence your chance of behavioral design system success. Something that I've worked with a lot is helping translate things, complex things, and vice versa with people to understand what the limitations are of our research and our product design as well. And that leads us nicely on to our fifth component. This isn't a long talk, you'll be pleased to know, so hopefully we'll wrap up in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But just the final part is about measurement. So what is this? Well, behavioral design systems have to support outcomes, and outcomes are typically, hopefully, usually measured. So what does this mean? Well, you have to understand what, where, and why to measure. These are critical factors in ensuring great quality digital health output. There's always a lot to measure. So what is there to measure? And I haven't covered everything here as well because there's so much. So for example, what is the quality of my design system product? Well, the obvious answer to that is, do some usability research. I'm not saying that is the only way to do it, but it's been a successful way for me professionally from a product perspective. But we also need to measure our process as well when it comes to this. So does my design systems process need improving? Does my behavioral science process need improving? Well, we can measure that with process monitoring and uptake as well. I know there's a big movement at the moment in the design systems world to understand what is the value of design systems. It's exactly the same in behavioral science. I'm responsible for capability development of that in what I'm currently doing professionally, and helping people understand the value of this and monitoring it is key for it to be being successful as well in a commercial setting. What else can we measure? Well, of course, there's the clinical and health measures. Again, I'm not talking about anything disease specific or outcome specific, but you have RCTs or other, experimental design or related methods. I've starred this. This isn't a quick win because you'll see in a second. And then also there's intervention measurement as well. I was thinking about the APPEASE framework. If you'd like to know more about that, I can't remember all of the letters, but it's about measuring the quality of your intervention as well. So this is a slower win as opposed to a quick win. So thinking about RCTs, randomized trials, and experimental or quasi-experimental design, it's difficult. It's really difficult. In practice, I've tried to merge some of this with things like pre-post tests and correlational design in usability study settings and other related techniques. It's not always easy because of your sample size and so on and so forth. But this is where this differs from usability, I would say. So examining your behavioral design system, what you've done through quasi-experimental or just experimental design, can, not always, but can give you greater credibility and give you the statistical data you don't typically get out of a lab study. Again, this isn't always possible. It can be prohibitively expensive. There are other quicker ways to do it. There's lots of guidance around how to do things like N-1 studies and other lightweight, quasi-experimental approaches. So I'm not advocating for a particular or specific approach, but the slower win here is just giving it some time and space to be a bit more credible with the research that you do as well from a measurement perspective. Okay, so the final part, what's next? I've appreciated that I've said a lot of words very quickly. I just want to take a quick step back and reflect on why I've put this together. Is it useful? Does it work? Or is it a load of rubbish? Which is fine because this is how we improve by failing. So does any of this make sense? Sort of. To me, it does. Within this space, I'm specifically thinking about behavioral science, the design systems that we have, the approaches that we take in healthcare. There's so many opportunities. And like I've said, this is by no means a correct or an exhaustive way of abstracting the complex processes of merging behavioral science, design, and UX into healthcare. There are many other ways of doing it. There's amazing people doing stuff in the space to learn from. I've just tried to think about what's worked and what's not worked for me over the last 5 or 6 years, and what I'm going to do as well, hopefully in the next 5 or 6 years, and hopefully onwards in my career in healthcare as well. So, what can we think about as a community of practice? Well, how does all of this stuff translate to a product level? And this is something that I'm working on in my own spare time at the moment. Is this translational bit between the theory that exists? Say, for example, you're designing for an illness in respiratory, for I don't know, asthma or COPD. For argument's sake, that's just a random example. How do you move from theory into selecting these behavioral components and then using them in user interface? And how do you do practical research for that as well? And one of the ways you can do that is bake this into your design systems guideline that's aimed at a specific product that you have. Again, this is not about stealing some nudge principles off the internet, like the reciprocity effect or some other classic, economic principles, and whacking them in there. This is not about that. This is taking more of a robust approach. How do I build better, more targeted behavioral research practice? Well, that's a really good question for me personally. I'm responsible for teams and research quality and output. And one of the ways that this can be done is thinking about, from a practical perspective, have you thought about this in your research ops integration? When you're doing research for specific health outcomes, are you looking at specific behavioral variables? Have you done your lit review? Do you understand what's going on psychologically and from a behavioral science perspective to give you a massive leg up in terms of your research quality as well? Then I asked myself, how do I integrate the behavioral side of this into my practice? Well, the two simplest ways to do this are through education and then scaling your behavioral science education. And then something that I have Googled this and I can't find it, but I may be wrong. So if I have stolen this, please someone point this out. But something that I've coined in my own head, behavior as a service. So how do you go from all these bits of behavioral science and theory and amazing stuff that people are doing in behavioral design and take behavior and use it as a service? How do you productize it? Is that the right way to look at it? I'm also doing some stuff in that space in my own spare time. So if anyone's interested in figuring out what behavior as a service is with me, give me a shout, because I can't do it on my own. And then the final question is, how do we share and build knowledge together as a healthcare UX community? You might not be interested in behavioral science, but it does have an impact probably on what you're doing. Well, of course, there's communities of practice, and there's lots of really, really good talented people out there to connect with. One thing I just wanted to highlight was just to reiterate this point of moving between the gaps. So this gap between health and behavioral science theory, the determinants, the behavioral variables that you select for behavior change, and we haven't talked about specifically behavior change today, which is obviously a huge part of this. And then how does that translate into UI? This is a massive gap. And this is a really hard thing to do. There's loads of different ways of doing that. It would be great if we could get towards a more useful model, but I'm not saying a unified approach is by any means the right approach or the right thing to think about, but something a little bit more rigorous would be interesting to discuss. So, final thoughts today. If you take one thing or 1.5 things away, I'd like you to think about this. Using a systems thinking and model approach to solving complex digital healthcare problems is key to producing better products and outcomes. We already have the tools, but let's work towards building the gap between applied behavioral science theory and application. Thank you, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Haydyn. Really appreciate it. So we have a couple of comments and I think just one question. I think one of the common question you can make of it, something as from Jesmond. So yes, it does make sense, Haydyn. I've been a UXer for a long time and I'm just finishing up my digital MSc. I'm super interested in the marriage of user-centered design with the way of medical community design interventions, PCTs, logical models, and the measuring outcomes of all vital. Thank you for a super interesting talk.
Thank you. Yeah, there's there's a lot of there's huge amounts of crossover there, especially my interests lie as well now in sort of hardware and the connector side of things as well. Yeah, there's so much crossover, and I know there'll be people in this call that super qualified health psychologists, and there's a lot of crossover between BCTs, logic models, measuring outcomes, which we can learn from in the UX perspective. So yeah, I don't have all the answers. I just know what's hard to operationalize, and we can try and do better. I don't know how, but we can.
Excellent. And our next comment we have from Claire, who's our next speaker. Yes, I agree. Personas need to be focused on behaviors to be effective.
Yeah.
Also grounded in the real research and no guesswork.
Yeah. Like I said, sometimes we use proto personas. I say we. I'm talking colloquially. In practice. I think what I was specifically talking about as well is having used personas a lot over the last 15, 16 years, the behavioral, the psychological layer on top of that makes them even more interesting. You're getting towards segmentation sometimes, but that additional layer can really help them make sense, where in the past they've just been random descriptions. But if you do have that behavioral data, they are more impactful, in my opinion anyway.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And just the last question, any sort of resources or books that you've read that will be able to?
Yeah, I'm surrounded by books in my office here, Theo. And what I'll do when I get a bit of time is I'll just put a list together, and if anyone else has got any resources, things maybe towards certain models and sort of bridging the gap between UX and behavioral science, I can send a list.
Fantastic. Haydyn, I can't thank you enough. That was a fantastic talk, and I'm sure everybody on the call would agree with that.